Once, when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, Who do the crowd say I am? They replied, Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say that I am? Peter answered, God's Messiah.
Good morning to you all. Well, that was a little lackluster. Good morning to you all. I know we're all sick, but we can be a little bit more energetic than that. I do have to say I was somewhat relieved. It's kind of a weird thing to say that you're relieved when you hear in the prayer request that people are sick and kind of dealing with stuff, because I'm definitely in that group of people. About, I guess, a week and a half ago now, I started getting whatever this bug is that's going around. And I thought to myself, well, I'm preaching, a week and a half from now, I should be fine by then. It's no big deal. And then Monday rolled around and I was still sick, and I was like, it's all right. I still got the whole week, plenty of time before Sunday. And then like Wednesday, I was still not doing so well, and I was getting a little nervous. And then by Friday, I was a bit concerned. And then yesterday, when I woke up and couldn't speak, I was very nervous. So I took a massive regimen of medicine yesterday and trying to keep it under control. So I will apologize up front that if I cough or if I sneeze, I'm doing my best to try and avoid that. I've got my trusty Superman water bottle here, so I think that will help a bit, but we'll see how it goes. Recently, I was home working on schoolwork, and I received a text message on my phone. And the message didn't come from somebody that was in my contacts. It was caught my attention because the number that it was coming from was in the 805 area code, which is located in Ventura County, which is where I grew up when I lived in California. And the message was unusual because it was sent to me, and it was almost as if it was the continuation of a conversation that had already started. It was just the way it was presented. It was almost like we had been talking earlier. Some time had passed, and then he was just, whoever it was just picking up where they left off. And I was a little confused by that, and I had that moment where I was trying to think, well, do I know anybody that I just haven't put into my phone yet that I was talking to, and couldn't think of it at all. And so I finally responded to the person, and I just said, hey, I think you might have the wrong number. I'm not really sure who you are, and sent that on. I thought, okay, that'll be the end of that. It wasn't, and for some reason, despite me telling the guy, I don't know who you are, not familiar with this number, he seemed to think that he still knew who I was and didn't seem to believe me. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but he kept trying to continue having this conversation with me, with whoever he thought that I was. And finally, after a few minutes of sending him a message, being like, no, seriously, dude, I don't know you. Finally, I just had to respond back to him, and I said, look, I just need you to respond back to me. And I need you to tell me, who is it that you think you're talking to right now? Who do you think I am in this situation? And maybe because of the directness of my message, maybe because, I was pretty sincere about going, I'm not sure who you are, it must have clicked at that moment. And there was actually kind of a long pause before he responded. And then finally I get this text message, and he says, well, I'm starting to think that you're not the girl I met earlier who gave me this number. As it turns out, the girl that he met that night apparently wasn't as keen on getting to know him and gave him a fake number, which just coincidentally turned out to be mine. And honestly, I felt really bad for the guy. But I also kind of had to laugh because it took a ridiculous amount of time before he finally realized that I wasn't who he thought I was. And he had this perception that he had built up in his mind of who he thought I was, only to discover that when it was all said and done, he really didn't know me at all. And identity is an important thing. I think we all recognize that. It gives us a frame of reference by which we can understand ourselves as well as those around us. And obviously the most common way that we identify people is through the use of names, understandably. The names that we use establish an identity, whether it's ours or someone else's, and often the name that we use for someone or the name that's used for us is often indicative of the type of relationship that we share with that person. I'll give you an example. This weekend, Sarah and I, it was a banner week, we went and we saw Justice League. And for those of you that don't know, I am a huge fan of Superman. And I am one of the 3 people in the world that have actually liked the new films that they've been coming out with for Superman. And one of the things that I have found really interesting in the movies, and it's really kind of true just throughout the comics in general, but specifically in the movies, I've been really interested in their use of names when they identify the character that we know as Superman. There's kind of this deliberate way that they define and describe him. Maybe I didn't turn this on. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. There's an on button. That's usually a helpful thing to use. There we go. If I were to show you this image, or show just anyone this image, almost universally, people would identify this person as who? Superman, right? Spoiler alert, right? Okay. It's both his name, obviously, but it's also a description of him, right? He is Superman, but he's also a man who's, super, right? So it's a descriptive term. He has these qualities, he has these abilities that are like nobody else. And so he's most commonly identified by those attributes. Now, of course, many people are obviously aware that Superman's name isn't actually Superman. It's Clark Kent. Though everyone in the world commonly identifies him as Superman, there's a smaller group of people within that broader population who understand that Superman really is actually a mild-mannered reporter who grew up in Kansas, and he has parents, Jonathan and Martha Kent. And so even when Clark is dressed in his Superman outfit, even when he's, flying around and doing things, the people who know his secret identity, people like Batman and Wonder Woman, Lois Lane, people that are close to him, they generally don't call him Superman. They tend to stick to Clark when they're talking to him. They identify Superman in a way that is much more reflective of the relationship and the level of intimacy that they share with him. But when it comes to Superman, there's actually even another kind of deeper level of identity that he possesses. For those of you that are nerds and already know this stuff, there's his Kryptonian identity, reflected in his name, Kal-El. Now, I couldn't find a picture of like a person that you would know, like, oh, that's Kal-El. So I just put a ship of him leaving Krypton. That's going to have to be our approximation for today. But these people people that know that he's Superman or know that he's Clark Kent don't always know this information about his heritage, where he's from, what his purpose is. To know this identity of Superman is to know the identity which reflects the deepest level of relationship and the deepest understanding of who he truly is and what his purpose is on earth. So as we can start to see that the identity one ascribes to the character, whether it's Superman, whether it's Clark Kent, or whether it is, Kal-El, it reflects the relationship that people share with him. In the broadest sense, the people that call him Superman call him this name. They haven't identified him incorrectly, but they've identified him perhaps incompletely. Because keep in mind, when people call on the name of Superman, he shows up to rescue them. It's not like he doesn't know that that's a name that people have for him. He will still respond to it. However, that doesn't mean that that's the best way of describing him or that it's the most reflective way of knowing who he is. People that call him Superman, that's as far as they will ever know him. He's the guy they call on, he shows up, some good things happen, and he goes away. But then there's a deeper sense that we see with the name Clark Kent. And the people who call him by this name, they certainly know him better, They recognize that there's a little bit more complexity in his identity than just this guy that, wears tights and flies around saving people. There's a greater depth of the relationship, but there's still kind of some distance, because even the name Clark Kent doesn't really reflect the truest sense of who he is. Ultimately, it's the people that call him Kal-El that they know the truest form of his identity, like I said, including his purpose on earth. Names help us to establish identities. And the names by which we know others are often reflective of the depth of the relationship that we share with them. For instance, by show of hands, how many of you have a spouse, a significant other, or a good friend who has a name for you other than your first name? Yeah, right? You have those people in your life that, sure, they know what your name is, but they probably have some other terms of affection or pet names and things like that that they call you. I know that I certainly do in a couple of different situations. The first one is actually my best friend. His name's Ben. And actually, for years, we have stopped calling each other by our first names. We actually often refer to each other as brother. And we do that because, basically, we're family at this point. We went to school together. We were roommates together for like 7-8 years. We spent holidays together. We were in each other's weddings. We attended funerals together. We've been sick together, and just on and on and on. Our identity as brothers reflects a depth of relationship with each other that we don't necessarily have with most other people. The only relationship of greater depth than the one that I have with my best friend is undoubtedly the relationship I have with my other best friend, which is my wife. Sarah knows me better, really, than anyone, and that's reflected in our relationship in part by how she identifies me. Interestingly enough, Sarah almost never calls me by my first name, just like my friend does. About the only time that Sarah calls me David, and this is a good thing, is when I'm in trouble. So when she says David, immediately I go into, chaos mode, and I'm like kind of going back through all my files in my brain going, okay, what did I do? What did I do this time? Because I know she's not calling me sweetheart, she's not calling me honey, she's not calling me baby, all that stuff. She's like, David, something is wrong. We need to correct. But almost always, she refers to me in some way that reflects kind of a deeper relationship that we enjoy together. Identity is a big deal, and it's a big deal in our gospel narratives as well. Our scripture reading this morning included Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" Obviously, it was an important question to Jesus, but it's really the foundational question, I think, that the gospel writers are trying to answer through their various accounts. Who was this man called Jesus? How do we make sense of everything that we've seen and that we've heard? And how do we accurately portray that this person also happens to be the Son of God? How do we convey what it means to, and what it looks like to truly know who Jesus is? Each of the gospel writers kind of approach this monumental task in very different ways, but today I want to look specifically at Luke and his gospel and kind of the intentional way that he conveys how people identified Jesus by the specific names that they called him. What do I mean by names? Well, for our purposes today, I'm not referring to Jesus's what are kind of known as his Christological names, things like Son of God, Son of Man, Son of David. Instead, we're going to look at the names that people directly called Christ in their conversations with him. So, if I was going to say Bob, but maybe I call Bob by a different name, I'm speaking directly to him. I am trying to get his attention and indicate that I am talking to him. Those are the kind of names that we're going to look at today. Much like Superman, Jesus was known by quite a few different names. Interestingly, in the Gospel of Luke, Christ is only called by the name Jesus on 5 occasions. I thought that was kind of interesting. I have him listed here. He's named Jesus by the demonic spirit, by an unclean spirit, by the men with skin disease, the blind man, and the crucified criminal, asking Jesus to remember him. It's really interesting. We could probably spend all day looking through just these 5 verses and kind of the use of the name Jesus. But it's interesting. For a name that we most commonly associate with him, his name is Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, it's actually something that he's called very infrequently, at least by comparison. For the most part, Jesus is referred to by one of 3 names. That's either teacher, master, or Lord. Whereas the name Jesus only appears 5 times as the name that is ascribed to him, the names teacher, master, and Lord, they actually appear a total of 34 times in the Gospel of Luke as an identity of Jesus, or what someone ascribes to his identity, rather. And depending on which name is used, and this is really where we want to kind of focus today, depending on the name that's used, Luke is subtly telling us, as readers, something very critical about what it means to know the Lord. Now, Luke, as you may recall, he was a physician. And you can see in his writings that there's a methodical attention to detail that's very befitting of a doctor. Whereas, John, for instance, in his gospel, he kind of gravitates toward, a little bit grander language. It's a little bit more kind of esoteric and a little bit harder sometimes to nail down. With Luke, he's a lot more systematic in his approach. I mean, just consider the openings to their respective narratives. If you have your Bibles, please turn to John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. In it he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created. Life was in him, and that life was the light of men." Now, it's great language. It's very vivid. It gives you an interesting visual, kind of an interesting way of trying to understand. But you kind of look at that, you read it, and you go, huh? Like, what's he talking about there? It's a little bit out there in terms of the terminology and kind of the accessibility that we have in understanding what John is talking about. But then contrast that with Luke. If you go to Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, the way that he starts his narrative is very different, and it's very indicative of kind of the methodical approach that he takes. He says, "Many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. It also seemed good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things about which you have been instructed." Very different opening. It's very methodical. He's explaining what he's doing, the rationale behind it, and it's starting to give you some insight into the mind of Luke. Luke is very deliberate as a writer, especially when it comes to the use of names, as we'll see. And in his telling of Jesus' story, the name that people choose to call Jesus are reflective of their relationship with him. Moreover, their choice of name for Jesus conveys the direction of their relationship with him, either pointing toward him or kind of facing away from him as well. And ultimately, the direction that people are facing in their relationship with Jesus is very much a determinant of their destiny. So the first name I want to look at is the name teacher. The name teacher is actually used 11 times in the book of Luke as a name for Jesus. Interestingly, it is a name that is never used by the disciples or his closest followers. The people who do use the name also are never really personally or directly identified. It's very kind of vague about who it is. They're kind of summarized in a very specific context. So for instance, we see, the people that called on the name Jesus, or called him by the name teacher, I should say, someone from the synagogue leader's house, someone from a crowd, experts in the law. It doesn't say who those experts are. It's not like Dwayne, the expert in the law. It's just an expert in the law. We see the rich young ruler. It establishes who he is, that he's rich and he's young and he's a ruler, but it doesn't say his name. It doesn't give us anything personal about him other than his status, really. And then we see the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes call him by that name, as well as the spies that are pretending to be righteous, as well as people in the temple. As we see in all of these situations, to these people, Jesus is a knowledgeable figure with a popular following. He's really no different than all the other teachers who were around at the time. Their name would reflect that. The thing that we tend to overlook a lot of times with Jesus is that, the fact that he was going around on the countryside and teaching and stuff was actually a very common thing. A lot of people did that during Jesus' time. So it wouldn't have been unusual. He wasn't, doing anything unique by being out there. So many people, that was the extent of their perception of him. He's just kind of like all these other guys. Yeah, he's saying some different things. We're curious about him. Maybe we're a little worried about him. But he's not much different. He's just this teacher. They're engaging and assessing Jesus on an intellectual level, really, more than a personal one. And these are people who know who Jesus is, but only in the very broadest sense of the word. The relationship that they have with him is one of opposition and kind of conflict, right? As such, Luke deliberately is placing distance between them and Christ and how he talks about them. What's interesting is that these people don't recognize Jesus' true identity. And so as a result, in the way that Luke describes them, he doesn't really recognize them. He says, here's what they are, here's who they are, who they're associated with, but we don't ever know them personally. Their stories and interactions with Jesus come and go, but at the end of all these narratives, their lives are basically unchanged by their interaction. The people who only call on him as teacher, frankly, are the farthest apart from him in terms of relationship. The second name is Master. And this is where we kind of start going into the deeper sense of identity. Of the three names that are predominantly referenced by Luke, the name Master appears the fewest at only 6 instances. And it's used in all but one instance by disciples. As we can see here, it's used by Simon on one occasion. Just the disciples in general referred to him by this name. Twice by Peter, and then another time by John. In the one instance when it's not used by a disciple, it's actually used by the men that are afflicted with skin diseases. And it's used in the context of a plea for mercy. And I found that kind of significant. What I also find interesting is that the name Master is never used by a woman, nor is it ever used by a Gentile. The people who called Jesus by the name Master, they recognize that Jesus is more than a teacher. They recognize that he's not quite the same as all these other people that are going around and have a message to preach or have an idea that they want to present. They recognize there's something different about Jesus, but we can't necessarily say that it's the deepest understanding of him. They may not have the truest sense of who Jesus is, but what Luke is doing is he's being clear in establishing that the people who call him Master are much deeper in that relationship. And what's interesting is that as they go deeper into the relationship, we actually get a better understanding of what happens to these people after their interaction with Jesus. Whereas the people that called him teacher, they kind of just disappear and we don't really know what happens. There's no real follow-up. The people that call him master, we actually know what happens to everybody. For instance, the disciples, we know that they will eventually carry on Jesus' ministry after his ascension. And in the story of the men that are afflicted with the skin disease, for at least one of them, we know that he was credited for his faith. We are given conclusion based on the relationship that they have. We know that, okay, their perception and their understanding may be incomplete, but they definitely seem to be much more on the right track than those who just refer to him as Jesus. But Luke's not quite finished with names. The final name is Lord. And I would argue that this is the truest sense that Luke is trying to convey of who Jesus is. The name Lord is used for Jesus most often in Luke at 17 times. It occurs most predominantly among the disciples. There's actually 4 occasions where the disciples call him by the name Lord. But then we also have individual accounts as well. Simon calls him Lord on 2 occasions. But then we have the man with skin disease. We have the centurion and his friends, as well as James and John. There's also the man that Jesus called to follow him, as well as the man who wanted to follow Jesus. It is said by the 70, by Martha, as well as Peter. It is said by someone asking about salvation, and we also see it said by Zacchaeus. It is the most inclusive of all of the names that people use to refer to Jesus. It includes disciples, and it includes non-disciples. It includes men, and it includes women. Interestingly enough, there is only one instance in the entire Gospel of Luke in which a woman identifies Jesus by any kind of name. And the one time that it happens, she calls him Lord. It's interesting. It includes people of faith and government officials. It includes people that are rich and people that are poor. And it also includes people that are called by Jesus, but it also includes people who are seeking him. They may not have actually had a direct encounter where he says, here, come follow me, but they hear about him and they say, Jesus, I want to follow you. And when they do that, they call him Lord. The people who call on Jesus using the name Lord, they recognize Jesus for who he truly is. He's not just a capable teacher. He's not just a powerful master, but he is Lord of everything. The people who call Jesus Lord, they don't stand in opposition to him. On the contrary, these are people that are responsive to relationship with him. They are standing face to face with him. They're oriented, looking ahead at him. Their attention and their focus is on him at all times. They are oriented in Jesus' direction rather than away from it. In his gospel account, Luke sets out to address Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" by providing his readers with really three different ways that the question is answered. More than a teacher and more than someone's master, the people who recognize and respond to Jesus as Lord are those who enjoy the greatest depth of intimacy with him. Whereas those who call on Jesus as teacher stand in opposition to him and are ultimately forgotten, those who call on Jesus as Lord know him in the truest sense and are blessed by grace to continue to be with him in heaven. The challenge for us, when we look at that and we go, okay, that's great, but the challenge for us is that our encounters with Jesus aren't like they were in the Bible. Jesus isn't walking around as a flesh and blood person right now where we might bump into him and be like, oh, hey, Jesus, or hey, teacher, or hey, master, or hey, Lord. There's already kind of some different distance just by proximity. And so the challenge for us is that we don't interact with Jesus the same way that people did during his ministry. For us today, I think that the question that we need to ask ourselves to draw from this is, if my life is a reflection of the relationship that I have with Jesus, and if my relationship with Jesus is informed by the identity I ascribe to him, what then does my life testify about Jesus? Who do I say that he is? Who do you say that he is? And does your life reflect that identity? Is he just teacher? Is he master? Or is he Lord? Is there a distance between you and Jesus that you need to address this morning? Is there something holding you back from getting to know him to a greater degree than you do right now? If anyone has a need, whatever it might be, we have people here who are willing to listen and to pray with you. And so I invite you to come forward if you have a need as we stand and as we sing.